All right, guys, good evening. All right, welcome to our last lecture for the semester. Tonight we're dealing with the last two chapters in the text, chapters 10 and chapter 11. Before we start, I want to just, and I've said this before, I want to thank everybody for the level of engagement you guys have participated in this class. It's been absolutely extraordinary. I don't know whether it's just a function of it's easy to ask questions and whatever because of your quasi-anonymous. I see your name, but I don't have to ask anybody to put their hands up in class. I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, I really appreciate it. It's been great. And this particular topic, which everybody pretty much knows something about, the internet and the web and that kind of stuff, it's been really nice to have everybody participate. So I certainly do appreciate it. Okay, before we start with the discussion on the John Oliver piece I posted on Moodle yesterday, I asked Tyler to follow up on a question he basically raised in our last class. And the question was this. He mentioned that he thought perhaps the but-for test, which is a very well-known test at law with respect to the assessment of liability, would be applicable when we were watching the examples of swatting with gamers who basically were the subject of being swatted by people who would call 911 and manufacture an emergency. And while they were gaming and they were being recorded gaming, the police would essentially knock on the door and or break into their residences and cause all kinds of havoc. And so Tyler was mentioning he thought maybe the but-for test would be applicable. I indicated to Tyler that that's a test that is used in civil proceedings, most particularly negligence, which basically ties it's one of the tests for finding somebody being negligent in that but for somebody's action, would the end result have in fact taken place? And I followed up after the class with Tyler and I asked him if he could do a little bit of research to see how he thought perhaps this particular principle of but-for would apply in the situation dealing with gaming. So Tyler, do you want to give your the results of your research to the class?
Sorry, yes. So there was quite a bit that I found on this topic and a couple of things that didn't become apparent. But what I had found was that the relation with relation to the but-for test and negligence with respect to swatting, for the but-for test to apply, well, there first of all must be harm done, and that harm must be as a result of the defendant's breach on either a duty of care or a standard of care that was that arises as a result of the relationship between the parties. So in the case of swatting, it first must be determined whether there was a duty of care between either the swatter and either the police or the swatter and the other party, being the other gamer. So, in what I found is that for this duty and standard of care to apply, what I wasn't able to find was actual standards or for gaming platforms or certain standards to adhere to as far as calling the police. However, I'm sure that these do exist. For example, such standards to adhere to within gaming may be presented in privacy and policy agreements. So again, for this but-for test to apply with respect to swatting, there must have been a duty owed between the two gamers or the gamer and the police to act in a reasonable manner. And in the case of negligence or cases of negligence, it is defined as taking a conduct that creates an objectively unreasonable risk of harm. So in this case, that does apply. However, again, I was not able to determine whether or not there was actually a duty of care between the parties or not. And if there is a lack of duty of care, then in a civil liability manner, the act of swatting, in my opinion, could give rise more likely to an intentional tort, giving rise to punitive damages. to punish the offender as opposed to negligence. And upon reviewing some of these cases, I didn't find any civil cases with respect to swatting. Most cases were responded with criminal action, which resulted in most cases the crime of public mischief under Section 140 of the Criminal Code.
Excellent.
So with respect to negligence, I think it must be determined whether or not there's a duty or standard of care first, which again, I said may be presented in privacy and policy agreements when gaming and when going on to these platforms. So I think it is possible that the but-for test may apply and negligence may be a factor, and that the plaintiff or the defendant may be liable for negligence under civil liability.
Great. Thanks, Tyler. That was really super. I really appreciate that. Just so again, the duty of care. So for those of you who aren't that familiar with negligence law, before somebody can be found to be negligent for their acts that causes harm to another party, there has to be a duty of care, which means there has to be a close and direct relationship between the parties so that one party would know that if they did something in a negligent manner, that it may well cause harm to the other party. So, you know, for instance, I have a duty of care to you as my students in the relationship of being your professor, that if I do something negligently that causes harm, for instance, to your, even your things like your grades, that kind of thing, I could be found negligent because I do have an obligation and a responsibility to you to teach you properly. Basically, to teach you the content that you expected to be taught and to do it in a competent way. So that's the duty of care. So in these swatting cases, what Tyler is absolutely correct. So where is the duty of care? Is there a duty of care between, for instance, the person who is probably a gamer themselves and the gamer that they decide that they're going to have the SWAT take place, right? Is, you know, do they have a relationship that is close and direct enough so that the one gamer would know that their actions would cause harm to the other one? And I think it probably would. But having said that, Tyler really touched on the most essential part of that, is that when one gamer or somebody basically calls the cops on somebody else, it's not so much a negligent act, because it's certainly not a function of carelessness, right? Negligence is unintentional damage. So what we talked about, or what we can talk about, and what Tyler referenced, is what's called an intentional tort, which means that somebody does something, you know, with full intent. And again, we're not talking about criminal, which Tyler is absolutely correct that it could be, you know, a criminal act of some kind. Maybe public mischief is a relatively, you know, relatively small offense to deal with this kind of thing. It may cause a lot more damage, which would give it rise to something more than just simply public mischief in the criminal sphere. But an intentional tort, for, you know, you have to basically intend to cause harm. And I think that's probably what's more appropriate in these cases of swatting, because clearly when somebody calls 911 to go to somebody's house and have them break down their door, and as we've seen before, we saw in the last class the example where somebody who was a victim of swatting was actually shot and killed as an innocent victim, then that's clearly involves an intent. An intent, you know, in the criminal law that involves mens rea, the intent to actually, you know, you intend in your mind to commit a criminal offense. So I think that's where this would really probably go. There are some intentional torts that this may fall under. So for instance, the intentional tort of assault and battery. So it's a tort, it's a civil tort leading to damages, and it's also a criminal charge, assault and battery. But if you intend to cause harm to somebody, and you raise a fear that that harm is going to be taking place, and it does in fact involve some physical activity, that's potentially assault and battery. But I think the one tort that really fits this dynamic of swatting is what's called the intentional infliction of mental suffering. Right? That's a very distinct and unique tort, and it's one that I think, and you guys can chime in here if you want. But I kind of think that's probably where we're going with swatting, right? It's somebody who intentionally inflicts damage upon somebody else by way of mental suffering, as in the trauma of having your door broken down and the police coming in and telling you to get down on the floor with your hands behind your head, that kind of stuff. Does anybody have anything to add to that? I think it's a really cool discussion we've had, kind of as a function of Tyler's question last day. Okay. All right. So thanks, Tyler. That's great. That was really super. It's too bad we didn't do that every class over the semester, because I think this has been a really useful kind of exercise. So I'll keep this in mind for the classes I teach, going forward. All right. So let's talk about John Oliver's video that I put on for you on Moodle. It's only 20 minutes long, basically dealing with facial recognition. Kate, your hand's up.
Hi, I was just going to comment on the video. There's like a couple things in the video that were really shocking about the Clearview and how they have like a whole database of people's, even any of us here, of their faces in there, and the police and whoever else they like are contracted through can access these.
Yeah, I mean, I found it very scary. I mean, and maybe that's just me, because I'm a lot older than you guys, so I'm a lot later coming to this kind of thing where people's pictures can be taken and other people can acquire them and use them for whatever purpose they want. I mean, that's not something that I grew up with. It's something that's only been around in the last 15, 20 years. So the fact that this company Clearview AI can scrub social media at will, basically, and then and create this this enormous database, and everything that the guy said, obviously he's on the defensive because he was being asked questions, but clearly the number one market for Clearview are police services, right? That they have 600 police services that subscribe, and I have no idea what that costs, but it subscribes to their service. And I mean for instance, the FBI is only one police service, right? So you would have, state police services, municipal police services. The FBI is federal in the States. There's no reason not to believe that you wouldn't have that in Canada, right? The RCMP, I have no doubt whatsoever that somebody like the RCMP would subscribe to this kind of service. All right. So yeah, Kate, thank you. That really kind of stuck out. Did you say there was a couple of things? Was there something else, Kate, about the video, or is that it?
Oh yeah, something else. Sorry, I thought I was still unmuted. Just along with that same information, how they said that only basically it was Canada and America right now that Clearview was sourcing to, but that they had many offers, and at this point in time they weren't, to different countries, and at this point in time they weren't, but it was to be discussed at a later date. So that's a little scary as well.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree. Tom, your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I found the face recognition really useful for maybe law enforcement when you're looking for criminals. While at the same time, it's also bad because it enables stalkers to get your information, and yeah, and also the law enforcement too. It's kind of the same thing. So it's a good and bad thing, useful and good thing.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that some more tonight with regard to chapter 10. Thanks, Tom. Shivani?
Yeah, I agree with what Tom said. Like, it's good and bad. And also, I was shocked to know that they have this platform where you could just take a person's picture and you could just pull up all their information. Like a random person could go into a cafe and do that. So, like, that was really shocking.
Yeah, I agree. Anybody else with regard to the Oliver piece? I mean, it's a satire, obviously, and he's very good at it. But the foundation of satire is the truth, right? There is no element of humor to satire unless it's actually based upon something that's truthful. Michelle?
I thought the Wonton Tat was from Clearview or Clear whatever, was lying about when he said about China that they don't do business with them. He just seemed like he's not being forthcoming with information. It's like they're already there and they're already working with them, is what I gathered from him. And I
Yeah,
just, isn't that,
I can agree with that. I mean, China is probably the largest market in the world for this kind
I
of.
thought that that would be illegal to take pictures of people in public and use them like that. Isn't that against the Constitution in Canada?
Well, we have a right to privacy. We have a charter right to privacy, right? So it would be a charter protected right. So so if the but of course you got to remember that the charter is only protects people when the federal government has done something wrong, right?
Well,
The charter
you know,
doesn't protect us from actions of individual corporations.
but you taught us that if somebody were to send us some intimate photo of us, and if we were to share that with somebody without their permission and consent, then they could come back and sue us. Well, shouldn't it be the same as if we're not consenting to take those pictures
Well, I
or
mean,
photographs in a coffee shop? And
well, I mean, we already know that the sharing of intimate images without consent is a criminal offense. That's a criminal code offense. There is no criminal code offense for just taking somebody's picture and using it in, I guess, for the lack of a better term, a non-malicious manner. Right?
okay.
There's nothing in the criminal code that forbids that. So again, a charter right to privacy is there, but in order to trigger that right, it has to be the federal government doing it. So for instance, the RCMP, which is an agency of the federal government, if they did this kind of thing, then yeah, you'd have a charter challenge to them using it. But if companies like Clearview did it, they're private corporations. You don't have charter rights with respect to private corporations.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Good question. Good point. Val?
My question was more towards like the racial, where it was inaccurate with other races. Have they used facial recognition in criminal court cases as like evidence where it may have, I'm sorry, my brain's super tired today, where it may have like gotten somebody put into jail where they shouldn't have been, or
I don't know of any cases where it's actually been a function of, for instance, a crime takes place and facial recognition pulls somebody's face out of a crowd, and then that connects it to a name, and an arrest is made, and off you go to court. But I mean, video surveillance is used a ton of times for criminal surveillance or for police surveillance. And again, we'll talk about this tonight some more, but to surveil, people. So, I mean, one of the first things that cops do when a crime has taken place is and you see this on TV and movies all the time, and it's true, that they pull up whatever video is available in the area. So yeah, they use that surveillance to basically, pick somebody out in an actual situation where they know a crime took place, and and identify that person using, obviously, you recognize their face in the video. It's not facial recognition other than human facial recognition, as in, oh yeah, that's the guy, right? So that's what cops do. I don't know of any cases where they've actually gone to the point where they've done that. Although it was really, really disturbing when he talked about things like using facial recognition for protests like Black Lives Matter, right? Where the cops basically start building a database of facial recognition data itself to go after people who they want to arrest, in these kind of protests. That's a really disturbing kind of thing. At least I was, I was. Tyler, your hand's up.
Yes, and I guess this kind of touches on that last note a little bit, but it was mentioned throughout the video how unreliable these programs can be. So to me, these programs are not a reliable source for holding sensitive information, or therefore for investigation or evidence in court, for that matter. And I also don't think these programs are a reliable source for businesses and other professional institutions to do business or transactions. And again, I don't think that programs such as these, like facial recognition, are a reliable source of evidence in court. And also because these are all susceptible to hacking as well. So that's another reason why these may not be reliable.
Yeah, you know, when it comes to things like new technology, in order for it to be admissible in a court for the purposes of proving the truth of something, it has to be verifiable and reliable. And you know what we saw in that video was that clearly, and this is this is what we just said earlier, is that yeah, it's pretty good for white white faces, Caucasian recognition. I don't know why that's easier than anything else, but it's easier. And then the less white, if you could say it, the going from from white to brown to black becomes more and more difficult, right? I don't know why that is, but that's obviously a major flaw, and particularly when it comes to law enforcement, with a gross disproportionate in the states arrests of African Americans, and for instance in Canada the gross disproportionate arrests of Indigenous Canadians, right, who are are in theory non-white, then it's it's troubling, right? I mean, how viable a resource is it and of course sometimes if if the cops don't have any other evidence to tie somebody to crime, they will reach for whatever they can get their hands on to try to get it in front of a jury. So if they have no evidence to tie somebody who they actually believe is the culprit to the crime, they will use whatever means they can, including some things like this, and obviously try to get it admitted for the purposes of getting it in front of a jury, because and this is called the CSI factor. That's based on an old television show. Basically that the whole premise of the show was that every crime could be solved with forensics, which has caused actually a real problem in criminal justice, because juries tend to think that if somebody's guilty, there must be forensic evidence that points to their guilt. And likewise, if they're innocent, there must be forensic evidence that exonerates them. So this kind of thing, if cops can get this kind of evidence before a jury, the jury tends to pay a lot of attention to it, because they believe that this is a forensic scientific tool, right? And they don't necessarily believe that, in fact, it may not be that reliable if the cops point to somebody in a piece of data that says that's somebody that we believe is the offender, right? And if the cops say, in our experience, yeah, we recognize that person, juries tend to believe that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's really quite dangerous. So anybody else? Lexine?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I find it a bit strange that.
Lexine, speak up a little bit. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I find it a bit strange that some time back, Hong Kong used a similar method, and US was the one that was basically chastising them about the method they were using and how much they don't approve. And it's funny that they're actually using the same thing now, and it kind of just clashes with everything. And it kind of comes down to the sort of a fact that if the price is right, then well, anything is possible in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. Kate, is your hand back up?
Yes.
Okay.
One more thing that I found was they were talking about in the UK, I think it was, the police, I guess, have the face recognition camera there. And I guess they have signs saying that they are there, that they have the cameras and all that up there. And a man covered his face because he didn't want his face, and the police pretty much made him pull down his face, take a picture, and then he was angry and got fined for being, belligerent to the cops. I was just like, oh, that's extreme.
Oh yeah, that really pissed me off.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, it's the guy. There's a notice put up saying if you go into this area, you're going to be a video of you. So he disguises his face because he doesn't want to do that, and then that automatically leads the cops to go to him and say, hey, take your mask off or take your hand down. We're going to take a picture of you anyway. And the guy like me is pissed off at that, and he gets fined. I mean, honest to God, that's just incredibly frustrating, right?
Yes.
It's not the way it's supposed to work. And in the UK, and I think I mentioned this a number of classes ago when I was doing some work at the University of Ottawa, this was like 8-9 years ago, where in the city of London, this is 2011, 2012, I was doing this work. In the city of London, you were caught on cameras at least 300 times a day. And back then, and when I was doing the research, and it's like, oh my God, that's just crazy. It's now 3,000 times a day, 30,000 times a day. You can't go anywhere where there's not a camera unless you're out in the middle of, the middle of the woods, right? It's pervasive. And back to Michelle's point, right? It's almost impossible for you to deny having your face or your body, for that matter, whoever you are, wherever you are, photographed, right? It's not even photographed, but it's video captured, right? It's damn near impossible. And and when they said in the video where that someplace, wherever it was, basically would ask for your permission before you would be captured. I mean, somebody would have to be sitting at a desk, in the middle of the road, with 30,000 permission slips, for people to fill out, because that's just how often people's pictures are captured. Does anybody, Shivani, is your hand back up?
Yeah.
Sure.
I remember in the video where a lady from Sri Lanka was falsely accused for terrorism. So, like, what's the outcome in that case? Like, was she compensated? Could she sue the state for the false accusation?
Well, potentially, I mean, I don't know. See, Sri Lanka has a different legal system than Canada, so I can't comment on what it would happen there. If that happened here, then yes. If so, for instance, she was on a terror list in Canada, say, and it was put all over the news, then yes, she could be compensated for damages. But in order to collect on the damages, and this is again part of the law of torts, she would have to prove that in fact there was harm caused, that in fact that is quantifiable. So her getting all of these texts and messages first thing in the morning when she's doing her final exams, saying, oh, by the way, you're being accused of terrorism, it's all over the news. It would have to cause her enough distress that it'd be worth her while to actually pay for a lawyer, issue a lawsuit, and go to court seeking damages, right? And chances are highly likely that it's not worth that kind of expense. But yes, in theory, in Canada that could happen. In Sri Lanka, I can't tell you. Pete.
Yes, I wanted to reiterate a lot of this facial recognition has been put in place since since they brought in the Patriot Act in the United States, which was covered to cover terrorism in the United States, and that took away a lot of people's rights. And I imagine the same thing has gone on in London, England, where they I'll say 20 years ago now, they had a lot of Irish terrorists operating in England, and this is probably why most of the surveillance cameras trying to prevent terrorism. So that people's rights get taken away when things like that happen.
Oh yeah, 9/11 changed the world of surveillance and travel and borders and all kinds of things. Absolutely. Tyler.
So I have a question, I guess, and this kind of relates almost to our whole course overall, I suppose. But is it always to be assumed that consent must be given for privacy or someone's privacy to be breached?
No. It's the level of privacy that will lead to whether consent is needed or not. Right. So you can take a photograph of somebody walking in the street without their consent. You're going to probably make them angry if they see you doing it. But the right to privacy is a charter right, and it's not something that exists between the public. So, but if you took that picture and you used it in a malicious way, then that right to privacy has been breached to such a degree where, in fact, it will cause damage and result in action against that person. So, no, while everybody has the right to privacy, it's always contextual. So it's always based upon what was done and how that right to privacy was breached, and how and in which way was it breached and how much harm did it cause. All right. Any other questions, guys, for the video that we been discussing? It's been a lot of great comments. Anybody else? All right, thank you. All right, so let's go then to the two PowerPoint slides tonight. All right, because obviously we're doing two chapters. So the first chapter is chapter 10, conducting online investigations. So, and again, this to a great degree, as I said at the very beginning of this course, this textbook was for the most part prepared for law enforcement training, right? You can tell that a lot of the questions and answers and what have you that were given throughout each and every chapter related to, if you're a police officer, how would you react in this situation? What would you do? What would you do to basically respond appropriately? And so the questions that we've been using for the breakout questions are along those same lines as well. And there's other kinds of things at the end of each chapter and in the cases they use as examples that really do go to how do the police actually deal with cybercrime. Okay, and so this chapter deals with how online investigations are in fact conducted in a overall conclusive kind of way. We've talked a lot about them already. We've spent a fair bit of time. We talked a lot about, again, people's rights to privacy, the right to, or the right against unreasonable search and seizure, which is a Section 8 of the Charter right in criminal proceedings. We talk a lot about that. So some of the stuff we've already certainly touched on, right? So, but here's in broad terms what the authors of the text have to say. So what every officer needs to know. So police services, and I would presume most all of them do this, have internal policies related to, and this is internally within the police service, the use of email, internet, computer resources to maintain security and confidentiality. So this is within the police service itself, right? So this is how employees, so officers, and constables and what have you in the police service, how in fact they deal with online devices and what have you. So they do it internally. And likewise, what the rules they put in place for that internal policy should also be used for the purposes of public sources and online investigations using things like open source intelligence, which we all know includes a lot of things like social media and what have you, right? And again, this takes us back to the prior discussions we've had on the rights of privacy around rules of search and seizure, which we've talked about at length. Okay, so why is policy important when assessing the internet at work? Again, this is police at work, right? So, they do have restricted use of work devices. So that's part of a policy in place because the improper use of work devices could adversely affect security and affect safety, right? And this is really important. The work that police do, right, when they're investigating a case is subject to access to information requests, right? It's also subject to Crown disclosure requests made by the defense, right? So if, for instance, somebody who's accused of a crime and the evidence against that person comes about as a function of IT activity by a police service, then the defense has every right to basically have access to how that IT was operated, how the internet was used, how whatever programs were used, so that in fact they can question and cross-examine on whether the data that was collected over the internet or online was done properly, right? The point of course is that if it wasn't, then there would be an application under Section 24 of the Charter, Section 24.2, to exclude the evidence from the trial. We talked about that in a previous class, right? There's always considerations about surveillance and what surveillance is reasonable by an employer. So in this case, again, we're talking about the context of police services. So how much can a police service actually surveil its own employees? And I can tell you, because I was involved with the police service for a while, that, officers, the rules that officers use that apply to how they do their investigations and deal with arresting offenders aren't necessarily rules that they're willing to comply with themselves, right? So while officers may well think that it's a good idea to have open surveillance on somebody in whatever context they want to do the surveillance, they're not going to agree that they personally are surveilled, right, in the workplace and or any other place, right? So it's kind of a two-edged sword, basically. And the policies for the internet and emails and computer use, they address the things that are called theft of time, theft of documents, and poisoned work environments. So we're going to go through each of those, right? So the theft of time, and again, we're talking about police services looking at their employees, right? Regards the misuse of internet at work. And what it simply means, it just makes sense, is that, and you guys would all recognize this in any job really, is, you know, how much time do employees use at work for their own personal reasons, right? How much, you know, and it's, everybody accepts it. Every employer accepts that you can't stop employees from using their computers or their laptops or their phones, that they can't totally stop people from, you know, doing some things that are of a personal nature, texting friends or whatever, talking to family, checking up on your kids, all those kind of things which are personal nature. That's going to happen. Right now, it starts getting a little abusive when there's, you know, any great degree of time spent by employees, and again, in this context, police officers who are on social media, right, who are looking at their own Instagram, Facebook, or whatever the platform is. They're doing that on police time, and they're doing it, you know, obviously they're going to do it so they're not going to be watched doing it. So again, there's that question of surveillance. But, you know, you just can't use a disproportionate amount of your time as an employee for that kind of personal use. All right, theft of documents. So this is a really crucial kind of thing when it comes to police work. So, you know, police work deals directly with a lot of confidentiality and a lot of confidential documents, right? So, you know, they can't, you know, and this is again, you know, for other outside of work, you know, uses, they can't compromise confidential documents for personal use or for providing information at a personal request. So they, you know, if you know somebody's a cop's mother or father or brother or sister said, you know, so and so, you know, is dating somebody, we think he or she may be kind of sketchy. Can you tell us something about them? Right, and so the officer, you know, goes to work and runs their name through CPIC, the Canadian Police Information Center. It's run by the RCMP, and said, yeah, he's sketchy. He's got a record for this, that, and everything else. Right? Well, you can't do that if you're a cop. And this is something they do all the time. Right? CPIC is readily accessible to everybody, including cops sitting in cruisers who pull somebody over for a traffic violation. Right? So it's an incredibly valuable database for the police because it tells them and the world if somebody not only has a criminal record, but in fact, even if it had a interaction with the police that hasn't led to a charge, even that's on CPIC. So that's the kind of information that they absolutely should not share with members of their family or friends or anybody in the public. But unfortunately, it happens, you know, quite often because it is such a valuable piece of or valuable resource for information. And then you also have what's called the poisoned work environment, basically where, you know, HR, and again, you know, this is just not, you know, contextualized to police, but workplace harassment and discrimination policies are in place in all kinds of environments. Most Canadian companies now have it in place. It's a pretty much standard part of the HR formula for how employees are to be treated. And this is there so that, you know, if one employee thinks that another employee or their boss, their line manager, whoever, has done something of a nature that makes them feel that they're in what's called a poisoned work environment. So they've constantly called them names, made jokes about them in front of other people, you know, God help them, circulate photos of them inappropriately, those kind of things, or texts, you know, that kind of stuff, then that's inappropriate behavior that is captured by the poisoned work environment. So for instance, at Algoma, right, we have what's called the Algoma University's Code of Conduct under the Workplace Harassment Policy, right? And so, you know, again, if anybody at Algoma, this is the employees, You as students have a whole different set of rights with your student union or student association, AUSA. But when it comes to employees, we have this code of conduct. So if one member of a faculty thought that they were being unfairly criticized by another member of the faculty, or they thought a member of the faculty was talking to students about them, as in, God, the last thing you want to do is take a course with him, that kind of thing, right? Well, that is a poisoned workplace environment. That's a genuine complaint by a member of the faculty saying, look, I'm being harassed. And it's not quite to the level of bullying, and that's obviously another issue, but I'm being harassed by this other person or this other group of people. And it's the job then of the head of HR, human resources, what they have to do, and it's almost mandatory now, is they have to instigate an investigation, right? And the investigation can take place internally. I can tell you what Algoma does in these kind of cases. Algoma hires an outside investigator, an outside firm that specializes in these kind of things, right? And they pay for that service. And so, if you're accused of workplace harassment, breaching the code of conduct, then you'll get a call from this person from this outside agency. They'll identify who they are, and they'll ask if they can interview you, right? And clearly you want to do that because part of the policy is that you pretty much have to basically participate in the process once it's started. And they'll ask you questions about it to verify if in fact the allegation of harassment is legitimate, right? Obviously they'll also talk to the person who lays the complaint, and likewise, at the end of the day, they'll prepare a written report and provide it to not only the head of HR, but both parties, basically saying, here's the result of the investigation, right? Okay, we have some hands up, so let's, all right, so Valerie?
I think mine was actually still up from the last one. I'm sorry.
That's no problem. Tyler, your hand back up?
Yes, and this kind of relates to what we had discussed at the starting of the class. And I was just wondering if such policies or codes of conduct or other regulations such as this, if they actually change or have an impact on the duty of care or standard of care that must be adhered to between the relationships between parties.
Well, you would think so. I mean, I don't have any cases or statistics along those lines, but the mere fact that a code of conduct is in place, basically requiring people to treat each other fairly and decently in the workplace, you would think raise the awareness that people have to be careful when they have a duty of care to other people, so as knowing that what they may well do may cause harm, and that's the duty of care. So yeah, it's a good question. There is a duty of care between workers in the same place because it's a close and personal contact, and that would basically give rise to harm if somebody wasn't careful in how they treated them or intentionally how they treated them. Workplace, this kind of policy, the code of conduct, tends to deal with intentional conduct more than duty of care giving rise in a negligence conduct. As in, oops, I didn't mean to insult you. In the academic world. But yeah, good question. You would think the mere fact that the code of conduct is in place would raise the level of care so that the duty and the standard of care isn't breached. Okay. So starting an online investigation, again, directed at officers. So, police services have proprietary information systems developed for them. Again, CPIC is one of those kind of systems, right? Each of these systems has its own specific policy and security requirements, right? Again, and here it says in the text includes access to CPIC and information from other sources worldwide. So Interpol, for instance, has its own database, right? And so police services, and the United States has its own database as well, run by the FBI. So, international police services tend to share this stuff very, very willingly and openly. So, if you are in any one of these databases, there's absolutely no hesitation by, Canadian police sharing it with anybody worldwide. That just simply is there to happen, basically. When an incident comes to the attention of a police officer, then those people who do the investigation, they require a plan. And so, there's a number of things they look for in the plan. I'm not going to go through it with you in detail, but at page 208 in your text, there's a really good breakdown of how a plan should be formulated by an officer. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 points, on page 208, basically saying how to, what you have to determine, what you need to discuss, what kind of records you need to maintain, what you need to keep track of, all those kind of things. That's in your text at 208. So, hopefully you've all read that already. So that's obviously a good thing, basically. And obviously, we talked about this last day. It's particularly important in searching social media to have a plan, because it can become disorganized very quickly, right? If you scrub social media, and all other kinds of open source data for somebody, you're going to have just a ton of data. So it's really important to have a plan in place as to how you're going to approach that data, and certainly organize it. Okay, so here's a brief video on how the FBI investigates cybercrimes.
According to a 2018 Gallup poll, Americans are more likely to be a victim of a cybercrime than any of the other top 8 forms of criminal activity. People can fall victim in countless ways, and the information stolen leads to billions of dollars in losses each year. According to the FBI, it's happening more often. We recently got insight into how the agency investigates cybercrimes and emerging trends from Special Agent Michael Foster. How would you describe cybercrime?
Cybercrime is actually any crime that is facilitated by the use of the internet. So it could be actually from an email that comes through, or just normal transactions that happen on the internet. Credit card processing happenings, right? We also sign up for bank accounts. Even our local library happens online. So any data or information that can be stolen or leaked through internet usage is considered a cybercrime.
I saw a report through your website that says very costly as well, $2.7 billion in just 1 year alone. Is it on an upward tick?
The dollar amount seems to be going up because of the financial transactions that seem to be targeted, right? We're seeing a lot more business email compromise that happens, which are typically targeting now businesses, not just general persons like you or me. So the financial dollar amounts between buying a home, right, seem to be going up. So yes.
Who seems to be the target?
Everyone, again, regardless of age, everyone. So the elderly in Arizona typically right now, as 2018, make up the largest growing population affected by cybercrime. They're also the largest group affected by gross loss.
If you're a victim, this can be devastating, correct?
It can be, but there are resources out there. If it's a financial loss, we encourage you to call your financial institution first. The faster you act with your financial institution, the faster and the better chances you have of getting some money back. It's not guaranteed, but we encourage you to contact your financial institution first, and then local, state, or federal law enforcement officers.
How often are you getting reports from people who say, I think I may have been a victim?
We get them all the time, and we encourage them to actually report in person or anonymously. But we also encourage everyone who feels they may have been a victim to report that to ic3.gov. We can't fight crime unless we know about it. So we encourage everyone, whether you believe you're a victim or you think you're a victim of a crime, to please report that to ic3.gov. So you want to note, again, dates, times, and transactions, any sort of identifying information, which would be a phone number, an email address, whether the person has an accent or not, if there was a phone call, misspellings. Keep a copy of those emails that you have them, right? All that sort of identifying information that you believe, if you would say, a police officer asked you, can you identify this person? Describe them for me. Those types of attributes. Again, online, they just happen to be more numbers-based.
What are some of the top cases that you tend to see here in the state of Arizona?
The top 10 are data breaches, like we just previously talked about. And then we have extortion is actually on the rise as well. Extortion typically happens through an email stating that they'll either release some photos or your personal data unless they're paid, right? Some sort of Bitcoin, a virtual currency, or purchases through gift cards, which you would then go out and buy. That is on the rise as well. And then you have non-payment of services or non-delivery. So in other words, me as the scammer would say, I'm going to send you something, but you have to pay me first, right? Or vice versa.
It may be hard to hear, but much of this is common sense.
It is sort of common sense, but we talked about that urgency before. When urgency happens, some of our common sense goes down. We just need people to take a deep breath. Taking that extra 30 seconds may save you thousands of dollars.
Okay, Michael Foster from the FBI, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Now that was kind of interesting, and I wanted you to see this for this really interesting point. What he had to say at the very crux of his little interview there was pretty much diametrically different than what Detective Sergeant Rice had to say when he visited our class last week. What did he say that was so different? Anybody? It was actually, Michelle, it was one of the questions you raised at the time with the Detective Sergeant. Do you remember what it was? Okay. What this guy said is basically, no matter what happened to you, no matter how serious or unserious or whatever the cybercrime was, call the cops. Right? Detective Sergeant Rice basically said the opposite of that. He said, you don't call the cops every time it happens because it's going to involve an investigation. It's going to involve a lot of work. It's going to involve probably more work than it's worth, right? Depending on how serious it is, right? So here's the FBI saying something that is diametrically different than what the Sault Ste. Marie Police Service said. Val, your hands up.
I had mentioned earlier about me calling the police when I was hacked, and I wonder if maybe that's kind of like the same thought process, is that maybe they didn't want to do the paperwork. Maybe it's different in the States where they need that crime recorded, because it's the FBI, right? Like, so it's United States laws versus Canada. I don't know. Is there maybe a difference with that?
Oh, you're right. I mean, it's a good point. And interesting enough, I mean, the FBI is obviously the federal police service in the U.S., but the U.S. is different than Canada in that we have one criminal code that applies across the country. They have 50 criminal codes. Each state has its own separate criminal code. They have their own state police, in addition to all the municipal police. The FBI deals with things that are of a federal nature. And I have to presume that just like Canada, things like the internet and that kind of communication is within federal jurisdiction. And that's why the FBI deals with it the way it does. But hey, why that would make a difference with respect to reporting versus non-reporting, I don't know. I tend to like to think that the approach of the FBI is a better approach than the one that we saw in Sault Ste. Marie. I mean, it would be pretty disheartening if, like, for instance, you, Val, who called because you're hacked and they don't do anything about it. It kind of makes you question, like, why did I call you in the first place, kind of thing, right? Whereas this guy is and he's in Arizona, but he's saying, if this happens to you, I think, for instance, your case, he would definitely take a report, right? That's the impression I got. So, why the difference? I don't know. But good question. Okay, so here's the question. So where do the police start gathering information with respect to an investigation? Well, obviously they do the things that are common sense. They gather up the known facts. They conduct open source searches. Google, right? Google is omnipotent when it comes to searching for people and their background information. Clearly the cops will use it every time there's an investigation. Employers use it every time somebody applies for a job. Doesn't matter whether you're applying to be a CEO of a company or whether you're applying to be a greeter at Walmart. I don't even think they have greeters anymore, but even if you're working for a minimum wage job, in McDonald's or Wendy's or Walmart, whatever it's going to be, you get Google, right? That's all there is to it, because it's such a widespread source of data. Right? What you do when you're doing the investigation as a cop, you start with a narrative that describes the crime, the alleged crime, and what the investigation might look like. And that's really important, because that sets out the framework of, the kind of places you're going to look for data, right? Are you going to concentrate on social media, or are you going to be looking more, or it's more important to look at the surveillance film of the actual crime scene, those kind of things. So, it depends upon what kind of crime it is and the kind of information you want to gather. Because the one thing that if you're an officer doing this, you have to keep in mind is that everything you do, right, is going to a great degree end up in court, right? That's the whole idea of the process. And when it goes to court, if it's going to go to a trial, and mind you, 95% of criminal cases don't ever see the light of day. They're either dismissed outright or end up with a plea of guilty, right? Some, very, very small percent actually go to trial and find innocence. 4% of cases, people are actually found innocent who are originally charged. So that's a pretty small stat. But having said that, when a cop starts an investigation, they don't know. First off, whether it's going to lead to somebody actually being arrested, but obviously that's the goal because a crime has been committed, but they don't know if it's going to end up being in a trial. And so it potentially could, every case they start could potentially be in a trial. And it's going to be in a trial. They have to know that they have to satisfy the Crown Attorney's Office that they've done a diligent investigation that is going to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person they think is guilty is in fact guilty. Right? That's the criminal standard of proof. But they also have to know that they are going to be, and their information gathered is going to be subject to cross-examination by criminal defense. That is the fundamental job for a criminal defense lawyer, is to cross-examine the Crown's case. Right? So, garbage in, garbage out is a really good rule. So, when you start a case, you have to make sure it's properly defined and the framework is set out such that it will do the job, right, based on the kind of crime it is. So that's really, really important. Cops will search for background information. Okay, Tyler, your hand's up again.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt. I was going to wait until the end of this section. But I was actually just looking over some investigations and jurisdiction here. And it seems that in Canada, the RCMP seems to handle a majority of the investigations, and I'm looking at one most recently that they called they named Avia, which commenced in 2014 and just ended in July 31st. So which resulted in $17 million and $31 million damages, and the arrest of an individual in the Greater Toronto area. And custody was taken by the Greater Toronto Area Financial Crime Section. And they arrested an individual that had been scamming Canadians since 2014. And I guess the individual and the scams had been coming from India, where they had actually taken out a number of police raids on illegal call centers in India due to the investigation.
Good, thank you. Yeah, you broke up quite a bit in the middle of that, Tyler, but I got the point. Hopefully everybody else did as well. So thank you for that, right? And so also now back to the investigation. So obviously they search for background information, both related to the victim and the suspect. Obviously, you have to have confidence that what the victim says is also going to stand up in court. Right, so that's incredibly important, and obviously you're going to want to know everything you can about the suspect. And to do that, you search relevant sites. Legal sites or that are available. A lot of these sites are open to the public. So court records are public records, right? So you can search there. It's now online. If somebody has been involved in any number of civil lawsuits, for instance. Right, so have they been involved in something where they've sued somebody or been sued by somebody in a lawsuit that may relate to the nature of the crime being investigated? That's a very possible way to search it. You have public search law engines like CanLII, so the Canadian Legal Information Institute. So hopefully most of you are familiar with it. It's free. And it's really good. It's funded. It's established and funded by the Law Society Federations of Canada, right? So law societies all across the country. And so you type somebody's name in there, and it's going to give you all kinds of information. Again, civil suits they've been involved with, criminal suits they've been involved with, although again, the cops will have CFIC for that, but, or tribunal decisions. If they're a doctor, have they been up before the medical board for inappropriate touching of a patient, that kind of thing. That's the kind of stuff you can find online easily. You and I could find that about our doctor like now, right? That kind of thing. You know, it's anything for lawyers and, or, you know, and if they've been disbarred, that kind of thing, or any kind of professions. And so all this kind of stuff is you know, easily accessible and can add to, you know, the information, the background information on a case. Again, social media can be checked. There's lots of business websites that can be looked at. LinkedIn, you can check somebody through on LinkedIn, what they advertise as their skills, their employment records, those kind of things, classified ads, phone books. So there's all kinds of data. And so you have to imagine that, you know, a police officer who is building a case nowadays, to some degree, has even a harder job to do than they may well have had 30, 40 years ago, when this kind of data collecting wasn't there. And if it wasn't there, it wasn't part of the process, right? But now, you know, an officer is going to be expected to have basically checked every avenue of resource possible, online and offline, but accessible to the police services to build a case. And if they don't, chances are highly likely that it's going to be picked apart by defense counsel. When you're gathering information about, for instance, if people have a website, then you can check what's called the WHOIS, domain name search. WHOIS isn't an acronym for anything, it's just called who is, basically. So every time you, if you register a domain, okay, so, and every business has one, obviously, and a lot of people have their own personal domains. If it's in Canada, you have to register with WHOIS, which means you have to give them your name and your address, essentially, right? So, and that's a website that's available to search people who are behind domains, and the activity behind domains can quite often be part of an investigation, right? You also have ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, that will give you IP addresses and ensures that IP addresses are unique, as in they haven't been duplicated. So that's kind of important. You also have the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, which may, under certain circumstances, disclose information on domain registrants over and above what's found in a WHOIS search, right? So that's kind of interesting, and certainly somewhere where a police officer would have to go if the investigation they were doing involved somebody operating with a particular domain and or corporate identity, right? Law enforcement, again, we talked about this a little bit earlier, can make requests to social media for information to obtain account records, right? Based on, you know, records that Facebook has. Almost all social media companies have a very specific portal that is available just for law enforcement, right? And they make that available for searching, right? It's also Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, I think, WhatsApp and what have you. So these things, again, are something that officers would use as part of their searches, all right? Here's a bit of a debate on whether the police should have access to social media.
The head of the Metropolitan Police says social media giants should hand over users' passwords within minutes of a request. That's as the mother of murdered 13-year-old schoolgirl Lucy McHugh criticises Facebook for denying access to the account of the man suspected of her daughter's killing. Stephen Nicholson was jailed for 14 months after twice failing to hand over his password to police. Investigators now face lengthy legal procedures in the US to obtain potentially vital information. As Facebook is an American company, under British law it is not legally required to provide access. Well, to debate this, I'm now joined by legal editor of Spiked Online, Luke Gittos, and former police officer Roger Gray. Thank you both for joining us tonight for this. Luke, interesting, of course, this is an American company. It is, of course, operating in the UK. So surely Facebook should be helping British police officers investigate a murder inquiry.
Well, look, this is obviously an incredibly difficult case, but we should always remember that hard cases make bad law. And the moment you start making exceptions to the established rules, we are on a path to despotism, and it's very problematic. You know, Cressida Dick came out today and said that social media companies should hand over passwords within minutes of a request. And that is a bad road. It's a road where the police merely have to raise an allegation about someone and their data is potentially fair game.
Right. So, Roger, that's the point. This man is under suspicion. This is an allegation.
I understand that, but all allegations have to be investigated, and I think perhaps her choice of words was a little brusque in terms of we hand over it within minutes. But I think information of this nature, where it bears upon things like, in this case, a murder inquiry, when terrorism is very much afoot in our country at the moment, I think getting access to certain types of information needs to the individual to be able to give a little bit more towards the law. It needs these big establishments to be more.
Where do you draw the line? I mean, Luke talks about despotism, and for example, you know, governments could go even further than that. If they don't like what you're doing on Facebook, then they can start just getting a password and investigating you. I mean, this could be happening obviously where Facebook's operating in oppressive regimes.
All right, so there has to be criteria, and it has to be policed. Forgive the pun, and perfectly understood, and it shouldn't be free licence to just go and look at what everybody wants to say, what they think is privately online. No, that shouldn't be the case. But the weight of issues is now such, again, with regard to serious crime and terrorism, where I think we've got to give some ground on this.
Yeah, we've got to wake up to this, haven't we now, Luke?
Well, look, remember that Facebook do have a policy of handing over data where there is an immediate threat to life or the immediate threat of very serious crime. So they do have their own policy on this, and they will cooperate with the authorities in specific circumstances. What's happened here is that we're having to go through the American courts because it's only the American courts that have the power to disclose the information that's required. And remember also that this particular defendant has been subject to the very strict and quite draconian measures under the regulation under RIPA, the 2000 RIPA Act, which makes it a criminal offence not to hand over your password in these circumstances, and it's immediate custody. So in a broad range of circumstances, that's actually quite a draconian step. You know, you can slap someone in prison immediately for not handing over your information. There are steps we can take.
What do you make of that, Roger? Is that fair to slap somebody put somebody into prison for not handing over a password?
I think it's the weight of issues again. If the issues are sufficiently heavy that they require some immediate action, and particularly we're talking about a murder inquiry here, but again, let's look about terrorism for a moment, then, you know, I think we need to be able to take these steps. You know, in this country, we are extremely democratic and we don't like our rights taken away, and I don't disagree with that on the whole. But I can see that the landscape is changing, I can see there are needs, and those needs will have to be met for the sake of the populace.
As I say, look, this is a difficult case and we can't make our decisions around difficult cases like these. There is a reason why this one is in the headlines. But police officers, time and time again, are given the opportunity to investigate people's data, and we have to have safeguards.
Anybody on suspicion, you can go into their house and search their house. What's the difference of searching their online life?
Well, you do need a weight of evidence in order to get a warrant to search someone's house. There are principled and long-standing laws.
That within minutes. Can you almost, Roger?
No, I'm afraid you couldn't. You would need to take some steps, and that's right and proper. Okay. You need far
quicker than what's happening with the US legislation allowing this access on
Indeed.
Facebook.
I mean, we look as though we're on two sides of a divide, but in fact we're not so very far apart, because I'm not saying, you know, that it should be an open book, that, you know, unbridled access should be given. I'm not enthusing about that for one moment. But what I am saying is that there is, as I used the term before, there is a weight of issues here with regard to very serious crime and with regard to terrorism, when we have to give a bit of ground. All of us have to give up a little bit of our privacy to stay safe.
But giving up that sort of ground could have implications on others. This man, for example, is saying, well, he's a bit worried about being compromised over information relating to cannabis. Now, that can actually implement all sorts of people who are in connection with him on Facebook.
I think when you start talking about the issue of cannabis, etc., in relation to the bigger issues, this becomes trivia. And I think the police would have to have the attitude that, you know, they're not going to pursue those sorts of issues if they come to light in the course of a much heavier investigation. There should be conditions. I completely agree with that. But at the same time, you know, as I said months ago, we have got to move on this. We have to.
Look, the reality here is that you need a framework in order to make these decisions subject to law. The framework we have at the moment is already quite severe on defendants. You already have quite strict punishments for failing to comply with what the police ask you to do. In this particular case, it's a bit difficult because we have to go to America and there's an ongoing inquiry. But what's the alternative? The alternative appears to be, at least from the police's view at the moment, that they should just be able to ask and be given. I don't think that's right, and I think that it's incredibly difficult to craft a system where you completely accurately weigh the balance of interests. The balance of interest should always tip in favour of the individual, and the reason for that is that the state has enormous powers at its disposal to investigate crime, and it should be that the courts place reins on that power. They have to hold back power, and it's in cases like this where we get tempted to redraw the lines. And although you might say, well, in this particular scenario, there's only a slight adjustment in favour of the state, it's that creeping, it's that slow intrusion onto people's private lives, which is so harmful.
About the restriction of power on police trying to investigate those who may be sexually abusing children online, for example. It almost seems that the same legislation is withholding officers from even getting access to these people and what they're up to. Is that right, Roger?
Well, we've been hearing some figures bandied about at the moment, which are terrifying. You know, we may have suspected it, but now it is confirmed. I just feel now that this is a change point where we all have a civic duty and law to uphold the law and to cooperate. And in that spirit, I think, and not in any unbridled way, I think that we've got to be given greater access. You know, the internet is a relatively new thing. These are new concepts, and it's still developing, but this is a development that needs to be addressed.
Very briefly, Luke, your final reaction.
I think bad cases make bad law, and in a case like this, the assumption has to be in favour of guarding individual privacy. We cannot go about making radical changes to the relationship between the state and the individual based on these incredibly difficult circumstances.
All right, guys. So, you know, that's a very, very common debate. It takes place all the time. It's not going to be any surprise to any of you who've listened to me over the course of the last 6 weeks where I come down on the side of that debate, which is with respect to the privacy and that if the police are going to have access to that kind of thing, they've got to get a warrant. Basically, they have to justify what they're doing and certainly shouldn't have automatic access. And even in cases that they were talking about involving child exploitation, child sexual exploitation, you know, it wouldn't be that hard to get a warrant and get it quickly, you know, to have access to those websites. So that's where I come down. I have this for you. I mean, this is 7 things that you should do to make sure that your Facebook is safe. So I thought you may find this interesting.
And we're coming to you live from outside our studios here in Asia with some breaking news. We have just learned, and our highly paid lawyers have confirmed, that copying and pasting a privacy statement on your Facebook wall does not in fact grant you any extra privacy or protection beyond the terms and conditions that you agreed to when you created your Facebook profile. Back to you in the studio.
That is shocking. What a pleasure to have you back for another All Things Secured video. My name's Josh, and today I invite you to look over my shoulder as I walk you step by step through the most important changes you need to make to your privacy and security settings on your Facebook account. If I were you, I'd pause this video, open another browser on your computer, or if you're on your phone, try to find a laptop that you can get onto, log onto your Facebook account, and make these changes with me in real time. They're very quick and simple changes to make, and I promise you they make a big difference in your privacy and security. And better yet, if you stick with me to the end, I'll even share with you my favorite power tip for those users who are very serious about maintaining their security and privacy in regards to Facebook.
Okay, let's dive right in. The first thing you want to do is go to your profile page on Facebook, which is basically just going to Facebook and clicking your name here on the upper right. What we want to do is we want to find this eye that says View As and click on that. And what it does is it allows you to see how your profile looks to the general public that isn't connected to you in any way. So if anyone was able to find your profile and look at it, what would they find? For a lot of people, they would find their friends list, their photos, connections, and all that stuff. But what it should look like is this. I've got my updated cover photo. You can't see any other photos. You can't see my friends. You can't see anything in my about where I work, places I've lived, anything like that, because I've restricted all of that. So if yours doesn't look like this, then the next few steps that I'm going to bring you through are very important. Go into the upper right corner on the right here, click on account, click on settings and privacy, and Facebook is doing a better job of allowing you to do a privacy checkup. So I want you to click on that privacy checkup and then who can see what you share. This is where we're going to start on looking at our profile information. So what you see is I've got my phone number, I've got my email, all my birthday, and I've set this to only me, to just friends, to only me. My relationships, this is especially important if, say, you've got a relationship with your mother who has her maiden name stuck in her Facebook profile. If someone were able to find that, that would make it very easy for them to find out what your mother's maiden name is whenever they're trying to break into your bank account. You can also do that for work, education, and the friends that you follow. All right, so clicking on next, the first thing I want to do is I want to limit the past posts. So what this means is instead of having to go through and individually go through all of my photos and all of my posts to set them as a specific privacy setting, what I'm going to do is I'm going to click limit, and it's going to give me this, basically a warning saying if you limit everything right now, you can't go back and change it without doing it on every single post. But that's okay. I want to limit all of my posts. This is something that's up to you, whether you want to do or not. I highly recommend it. There's no reason for you to make all of these things public. Next, you want to look at your future posts. Who do you want to be able to see your future posts by default? Now, you can change this on specific posts if you like, but I want to set it to, you can set it to specific groups that you want, or you can just set it to direct friends, which is what I would recommend you do. Same with stories. Who can see those? And finally, we want to look at anybody that you've blocked. If this is something that you do, you can keep them on that block list. And what that's going to do is now when you look at how your profile is viewed by the public, it's going to be much more sparse. You're not going to be giving away tons of free information to anybody that wants to find out who you are. Okay, next we want to look at how people can find your profile on Facebook. Here we are again on the settings and privacy in the privacy checkup, and I want to click on how people can find you on Facebook. This means that if they search on Google for your name, will your profile come up in the search? So I want to look and say who can send friend requests. First of all, I only want friends of friends to be able to send friend requests. I don't want some random stranger that I don't know. Now, maybe that's not the case. Maybe you do want strangers. You can even set everyone if you wanted to, but I recommend having friends of friends. Now, next, you want to decide who can look you up based on your phone number and your email address. I decide that I only want friends to be able to look me up by phone number and then friends of friends by email, but this is entirely up to you. And finally, and this is very important, you want search engines to not be able to index your profile, which means if someone searches for your name, it will show up in Google. I don't really want that. I don't have any need to have that done. If somebody wants to connect with me, they will probably be connected to another one of my friends. So I turn that off. And that is how you make sure that you don't have your search visibility for your profile set to on. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is facial recognition. Facebook has the ability, whether you know it or not, to take any photo or video that is uploaded to their servers and scan it for your face and then tag you in that photo. I would much rather have my friends or family tag me in anything that they upload. I don't like Facebook having the ability to do that. So if you want to turn that off, click here on the upper right for your account. You can do it in the privacy checkup, but we're going to look directly into the settings here. On the left side, you're looking for face recognition, and you want to make sure that this is set to no. We don't want to give Facebook the ability to recognize us in photos and videos because, let's just be honest, that's a little bit creepy. Okay, since we're already here in the settings page, let's shift over to something known as off Facebook activity. On the left side here, you're going to see your Facebook information, and you're looking for this off Facebook activity tab. It's a new tool that Facebook's given us to allow us to see the kind of information that other companies off of Facebook gather on us and give to Facebook in order to allow them to advertise to us better. So you can click here on Manage Off Facebook Activity to see which companies and websites are doing that. And I've already cleared mine, but you'll probably see a number of them on yours. You can clear that history if you like. You can also manage future activity by clicking this Manage Future Activity button and then turning it off. And of course, Facebook's going to give you this warning. They don't want you to do this, but you can turn this off and then make sure that that is no longer information that Facebook has. They're still going to be collecting that information, but it's not something that they can use to advertise to you. Next, let's go back into the privacy checkup here in the settings and privacy, and we're looking for your ad preferences on Facebook. Again, this is all information that Facebook collects on us and puts under our profile, and really they're never going to stop doing that. But what they can do, what we can request that they do, is that they don't associate that information with our profile for the purpose of ad tracking. So for instance, if I go in here, it's going to give us all this information about ads, and then I can tell them what kind of information that other advertisers can use in order to advertise to me. Can they use the fact that I'm married? No. Can they use my employer? No. Can they use my job title or my education? No. I don't want any of that stuff to be available to advertisers. And then my social interactions. If I like something, what Facebook can do is it can show it to some of my friends and say, hey, this person, your friend, liked this, and so you should like it too because they're paying us to advertise to you. I don't want my likes to be able to be used in that way. It just feels wrong. And so I set this to only me. I don't want it to be my friends. I want it to be only me. All right, the last thing we want to talk about here is location services for our mobile devices. Truth be told, most of us use Facebook on our mobile devices, and I don't feel comfortable having the Facebook app on my phone, and I highly recommend you delete it if you can muster up the strength to do that. But if you can't, what you really need to do is go in to your settings up here and then find location on the left side. You want to make sure that the location history for your mobile devices is turned off. You can do the same thing in your mobile device, and I recommend you do that. Or you can also do it here on the desktop settings. So that's really the basics of what you need to do to control the amount of information and privacy that you have on your Facebook account. But there's one more thing, this power tip that I highly suggest you do, and it's related to something called a Facebook pixel. As a website owner, one of the things that I can do is I can set a Facebook pixel on my website that will track any user that has a Facebook account on my website. And then I can use that information to create an audience that I can advertise to. And websites all over the internet do this. And there's very few ways that you can get around this, but there is one that I highly recommend, and that's if you're using a browser like Firefox. It's one of the reasons why I prefer Firefox over Chrome. But if you look here on Firefox, I've got this Facebook container, and what this Facebook container does is it doesn't allow Facebook to follow you all around the web. So let's take an example. Let's say if I were to go to usatoday.com, what you're going to see here is that this Facebook container is going to protect me from being tracked by USA Today through Facebook so that they can advertise to me. I know most people love Chrome. I loved Chrome as well, but by converting over to Firefox, it gives you an opportunity to really fence in Facebook's ability to follow you anywhere you go on the web. That's all I got for you. If you want to leave other ideas in the comments below, I welcome them there. Give this video a thumbs up, and thanks.
So wow, that was a lot. So now you guys, I guarantee that the vast majority, if not all of you, are use social media more than I do. So maybe a lot of you already knew about all those things, although I doubt anybody knew them all. If you did, wow, good for you. And I think I mentioned this earlier too. I mean, I have two daughters, both with children of their own. One is very, very open with social media. She posts herself, her husband, he's a teacher, but he's also a musician. So he plays a lot. He puts a lot of that on social media. And their little girl, who's 2, they put a lot of that stuff that my wife and I can watch it, which is wonderful. We really like to see that. In addition, obviously, to things like FaceTime, which is god awful great, right, to have FaceTime. So that that's wonderful. But my other daughter is, whose daughters are like 8 and 10 years old. She's very, very wary of social media. She just is, she's very privacy in tune with the keeping things, within the family kind of thing. So this is something that I will actually send her because this is something that she would actually take the time to ensure that she followed the steps, those 7 Facebook settings basically to protect privacy. She would do that. So I'm not sure that there's a lot of people who are as concerned as my daughter may well be about protecting privacy on Facebook, but it's really, really cool that stuff is out there. Okay, next. So what are takedown requests and how can they help an investigator? So what this basically is under certain circumstances, removal of offending content can be taken down off the internet, all right? And this is a really it's certainly something that is widely sought, but very seldomly granted, right? So, there are, each jurisdiction has its own applicable statutes that refer to what can and cannot be taken down. Things that are highly inflammatory and of a exploitive nature, most jurisdictions have legislation that says that there's no question on request that should be taken down, right? And that just makes all kinds of sense in the world. Things like sexually explicit pictures and what have you. But having said that, there's lots of material where, there's something that you did in the past that ended up on social media or ended up being reported by the press. And most of the press in Canada, for instance, we have a very closed shop when it comes to press. You have you have Post Media, which is the National Post, and the Financial Post, and you have Torstar, which is the Toronto Star, and they have all kinds of smaller outlets. So, for instance, the Sioux Star here is a small part of Torstar, the Toronto Star newspaper chain. You have the Sun Media, so you have the Toronto Sun and you have the Calgary Sun and all those kind of papers. So we really just have those three major conglomerates of press institutions, and they all have their own online media. So without a doubt, everything nowadays that is printed in a newspaper that you can actually get delivered to your door. Not many of them, the Toronto Star, for instance, or the Globe. I'm not sure what the Globe, the Toronto Star doesn't come to your door in the Sioux, but you can go online and read the Toronto Star, right? So if there's something in your past that you're not happy with, that you think maybe, even if it's defamatory, you don't think it's true, or it was something that you've done that you regret having done, and it's there online. And again, let's go back to Google. So again, people applying for jobs, they are Googled right away, and quite often these kind of things rise to the top, especially if they were famous at one particular time or another. They got lots of press, then they tend to be clicked on more often and kind of rise to the top of Google searches. So you have the right, you have the absolute right to contact Torstar or Post Media or whoever it's going to be, and basically say, look, you have this article that was published on March 15th, 2012, and I'd like to have it removed. It's causing me a lot of grief. It's causing me difficulty getting a job, and or other circumstances where it affects me personally. And you can make that request, and it will go to an editorial board at one of these papers, and they will review it, and they will come back with a decision for you. And sometimes they'll come back and say, yes, we don't see any need to keep this any longer online, and so we'll remove it. We appreciate the fact that it's causing you harm, and we as an editorial board, we appreciate that, and we will remove it. But if it has any newsworthy aspect to it, right? If it's something that was again, read quite widely at the time, and it stands out, the answer is going to be no, right? The editorial board is going to come back to you and say that it's newsworthy. We have the right to the freedom of the press, right? We have the right to basically keep this information out in the public domain forever, as far as we're concerned, which again is very much different than what it used to be. If you had an article that appeared in the Toronto Star in 1965, I guarantee you in 1975, nobody could find it, right? You have something that appeared in the Toronto Star publication in 2005 now, and you'll find it in 2065, right? That's just the way these things work. So while you have the right for these takedown requests to be made, whether they in fact will be granted is another whole story. And how they can help an investigator, again, is totally within the context of the investigation itself, right? And lastly, practical tips on reducing and removing an online presence. So again, this is just what I talked about. You can request to remove offensive material, but again, it's totally up to the person who published it, the institution who published it, whether it's come down or not, and if it falls within that domain of the public's right to know, then chances are highly, highly likely that it's never coming down. Okay. All right, guys, so that was the first lecture. So now we're going to be doing the lecture on future technology. All right, so we're going to be going another hour or so for this class, including the breakout questions. So sit tight, let's get going. So chapter 11, potential opportunities and threats of future technology. This is kind of a cool part of the textbook because we're talking about things that are in development and or are very new, but may well have a great impact on our lives going forward, basically. All right, so clearly there's a need to maximize the benefits of technology. This is both from the police point of view and from the cyber criminals point of view, right? Again, the more advanced cyber criminals become with respect to technology, the more, and the faster the catch-up has to be by police services, right? Artificial intelligence, we're going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes, is certainly an important part of that process. And recruits who have basic training for the police service. So for instance, in Ontario, most police services, you do 6 months training at the police college in Aylmer, Ontario. It has a section on cybercrime, right? So just like there's sections on theft and robberies and homicides and frauds and all those kind of things, now there's a section being taught on cybercrime, right? Let's talk about the future of unmanned aerial systems. So these are drones, right? Everybody knows what drones are. They're becoming a really popular kind of thing. They certainly aid police in investigating and solving crimes. Basically, they increase public safety with the fact that they're up there and they're being used. They're used by police to search for people and search for evidence, to pursue assailants who are on the run kind of thing. Certainly they can be used for surveillance of high-risk areas. I guarantee you that in almost every group that comes together for Black Lives Matter protests and public gatherings, there's drones overhead by law enforcement, right? That's just what they do nowadays. Basically they're used by criminal enterprises for various purposes. It's very easy, for instance, to have a drone, hover over a ATM machine and at quite an altitude, so you don't necessarily hear it, and they can zoom in and get pins from people's cards, their debit cards, their credit cards, those kind of things. There's stories in your textbook, and there's been movies about this kind of thing, where in fact contraband is delivered to prisons over prison walls. It's a great way to get stuff to prison walls. Drugs, for the most part, tend to be the kind of contraband that gets into the prisons that way, basically. And cyber criminals use drones to watch police activity. So if some kind of an activity is going on, a drug deal is going on somewhere in a city, there's nothing to stop the gangs doing this kind of activity from using drones to keep a watch over the area surrounding where the drug deal is going down, to surveil it, so to ensure that the police aren't on their way. That's a no-brainer for the use of a drone, right? Here's a video on how they can be used as an investigative tool.
Well, they're called unmanned aerial systems, UAS for short, but most people just call them drones.
Yeah, those flying vehicles are not only becoming more popular among consumers, as Susan Kim explains, more law enforcement agencies are adding them to the force. New at 10.
A handful of local departments have drones, but the Waukesha Police Department may be a leader in drone use. They're already looking for ways to purchase the next level in aerial technology. Inside this simple backpack sits one of the Waukesha Police Department's newest crime-fighting tools. This is the Phantom 3 Professional, and the department is convinced it makes them better.
This is a life-saving piece of equipment that actually will increase our ability to effectively provide life-saving assistance to our community.
Life-saving because officers can get it up in the air fairly quickly to get a view they can't see from the ground. Lieutenant Pergandy says that can be vital in natural disasters, finding suspects on the run, and locating missing people, like 10-year-old Andrew Oncom. Andrew is autistic, nonverbal, and disappeared in the cornfields behind his house. More than 300 volunteers searched for him, and so did this drone.
In the end, Andrew was located by citizens, but I believe the drone helped us in order to ensure that he wasn't in the river.
Now, Waukesha police,
this particular one here is called an Inspire,
are eyeing
we have it outfitted with actually 2 cameras.
Another, more high-tech drone. This is a FLIR-equipped drone. It has a camera with thermal imaging capabilities. From the air, it can help police find people or evidence on the ground by measuring heat.
There we are right there.
So it doesn't have to be at night.
No. So when we're out there searching for a missing child, or let's say a fugitive on the run, it's going to sense the difference between the temperature of the ground and the surrounding area and a human.
Adam Andrews volunteered his FLIR drone in the search for Oncom. This is our first look at his infrared video from that search. Here you can see the long line of volunteers in the cornfield, but it also picked up other objects, like this rabbit you can see scampering away from searchers.
So while you don't always find who you're looking for initially with the thermal camera on the initial search, you're able to also rule out a lot of things that would waste a lot of time for traditional methods.
But the FLIR drone is expensive, about $15,000.
You have to ask yourself, what is a human life worth? And it's well over that. I mean, that's a small investment that we can give in order to protect the community.
A local business donated the first drone to Waukesha police, and the department is looking for ways to get that second drone without going to taxpayers as well. Police would like to get it next year. Susan Kim, today's.
Now this piece is 4 years old, so I could tell you that drones are now used, almost across the board with all police forces, where back in this video, it said it was kind of unique in this particular police force. And, the price of them are going down, as all technology does over the course of time. This next video I'm going to show you is relates to the use of drones and how the drones and their activities themselves, can be criminal activity.
A nightmare situation for pilots and passengers, a drone striking a plane at high altitude and top speed. This experiment from the University of Dayton shows a worst case and unlikely scenario, but there have been several near misses, with drones coming within a few feet of commercial aircraft, so the industry doesn't take any chances.
Depending on the speed of the drone, or the relative speed of the drone and the aircraft and the weight of the drone, you can get some significant damage. With a drone collision, against something like an A380 or an A320 or whatever it happens to be, you risk killing maybe 200-300 people or more.
It's not the first time an airport has been closed due to illegal drone activity. In July 2017, some flights from Gatwick Airport were delayed or diverted after a drone was spotted flying on the airport's approach path. But previous incidents have been dealt with in a matter of minutes, not hours. Now the police say the disruption is deliberate. The price of drones has fallen dramatically. They're now available in catalogues and toy shops, and in the UK you currently don't need to register your purchase. Although it's illegal to fly within a kilometre or about 1,000 yards of an airport, those hoping to cause disruption can easily flout those rules.
I think the real point is that, it is an asymmetric threat and we need to deal with it effectively. And the people that are responsible for the security of airports and things need to invest to ensure that we've got good strength and depth in terms of the security for people operating out from airports.
Drone manufacturers can build in geofencing, which stops the drone flying near an airport, although that can be easy to overcome. They could use a signal jammer that stops the remote control communicating with the drone, but that won't work if it's flying along a pre-programmed path. Now companies are developing counter-drone technology to deal with the threats, like this drone-catching net deployed from another aircraft. And aviation giant Boeing has showed off this drone-busting laser that heats up an aircraft's battery and makes it catch fire. The rules in the UK are expected to tighten in 2019 with the introduction of a drone register. But the problems at Gatwick today show that this is not something legislation alone will fix. Chris Fox, BBC News, London.
Yeah, what they didn't say is what actually happened, I guess probably after most of this was filmed, is a couple of years ago in Gatwick, some people sent a bunch of drones up into the airspace. Gatwick is the second largest airport in England. It's Heathrow is the largest, just outside of London, and Gatwick is just a little further outside of London. So it's a very, very busy airport. And they sent the drone up and it shut down the airport for 3 days, right? And you can imagine that's thousands of flights being canceled. That's tens of thousands of people being inconvenienced, right? So the people who did that, in fact, were charged. And it was just public mischief because they didn't intend to cause any real injury. They certainly didn't, as we saw at the beginning of the video, intend for the drones to go into the wings of planes that were actually in the air. But it was looked at very seriously. So the charge of public mischief was kind of like low-hanging fruit for the purposes of charging somebody, because they couldn't, the cops and the Crown Prosecution Service, couldn't prove that they intended to cause any real harm. Okay, but if they had, if they, had in fact taken down a plane, then charges along the lines of criminal negligence causing death potentially would have certainly been on the table. Okay, so let's now talk about the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is an interesting kind of concept. What that deals with or talks about is all kinds of things that we have around us, right, that we don't necessarily access, for the purposes of getting to the Internet itself. They're not like laptops, computers, or phones, but they use the Internet, right, for the purposes of functioning. Webcams and printers that basically, aren't hardwired, that, just remote printing. Smart TVs, right, have, access to the internet basically, so the purpose of it basically is, to use the internet, but it's not there for searching the web, so to speak, that kind of thing. That's not the primary purpose. A lot of fridges now have access to the internet, so you can you have a screen, you can see what's inside. You can actually, some of them are very sophisticated. You can program what you're running short on, milk's getting short, those kind of things. How they do that, I don't know, but they do, right? So that's kind of the Internet of Things, the IoT. And what the problem with this kind of thing, these kind of things is that unlike your computer or your phone for that matter, they tend to lack any serious forms of encryption. Right? And the reason for that is kind of obvious. They're not being developed as computers per se. They just use computer capacity to operate, right? So, people don't think about the manufacturers. Frigidaire doesn't think about them, or Samsung for that matter, with TVs doesn't think about them, that they need high levels of encryption because they're not storing data like your laptop is, your phone is, those kind of things. So they have low security standards, and that can cause some real problems. And it can cause some really serious problems when it deals with things like critical infrastructure. So for instance, power plants, including nuclear power plants, hydro power plants, those kind of things, or traffic controls, things that, that you take for granted every day long, that that when your light is green, and you drive through it, that's fine. When you come to a light that's red, you're going to know in a relatively short period of time, that red light is going to turn to green, and that green is going to turn to orange or amber, all these kind of things, and they allow a safe flow of traffic. But, if all the lights were turned green at the same time, right? Well, that's a real problem. There's going to be some collisions until people realize that the lights are all green. And then what will happen is people get out of their cars and start directing traffic themselves. That's just what we do, right? But what happens when a nuclear power plant, is hacked, right? And again, it's hacked not because it's a computer itself, but it's hacked because it has computer systems operating it, right? That could be a real problem. So those are kind of the things that you have to pay attention to, right? And of course, within the context of law enforcement, these are the kind of things that when, they are hacked, right, they give rise to investigations because, something obviously harmful has happened, right? And likewise, there's privacy concerns relating to whatever personal data happens to be on, whatever these IoTs are that, collect data as they're being used, right? One of the ways that has been developed, and it's a very sophisticated kind of way to develop and counter these kind of IoT threats, is called blockchain technology. And the next video describes basically how blockchains work.
Blockchains are incredibly popular nowadays. But what is a blockchain? How do they work? What problems do they solve? And how can they be used? Like the name indicates, a blockchain is a chain of blocks that contains information. This technique was originally described in 1991 by a group of researchers and was originally intended to timestamp digital documents so that it's not possible to backdate them or to tamper with them, almost like a notary. However, it went by mostly unused until it was adapted by Satoshi Nakamoto in 2009 to create the digital cryptocurrency Bitcoin. Now, a blockchain is a distributed ledger that is completely open to anyone. They have an interesting property. Once some data has been recorded inside a blockchain, it becomes very difficult to change it. So how does that work? Well, let's take a closer look at a block. Each block contains some data, the hash of the block, and the hash of the previous block. The data that is stored inside a block depends on the type of blockchain. The Bitcoin blockchain, for example, stores the details about a transaction in here, such as the sender, receiver, and the amount of coins. A block also has a hash. You can compare a hash to a fingerprint. It identifies a block and all of its contents, and it's always unique, just as a fingerprint. Once a block is created, its hash is being calculated. Changing something inside the block will cause the hash to change. So in other words, hashes are very useful when you want to detect changes to blocks. If the fingerprint of a block changes, it no longer is the same block. The third element inside each block is the hash of the previous block. And this effectively creates a chain of blocks, and it's this technique that makes a blockchain so secure. Let's take an example. Here we have a chain of 3 blocks. As you can see, each block has a hash and the hash of the previous block. So block number 3 points to block number 2, and number 2 points to number 1. Now the first block is a bit special. It cannot point to previous blocks because, well, it's the first one. We call this block the Genesis block. Now let's say that you tamper with the second block. This causes the hash of the block to change as well. In turn, that will make block 3 and all following blocks invalid because they no longer store a valid hash of the previous block. So changing a single block will make all following blocks invalid. But using hashes is not enough to prevent tampering. Computers these days are very fast and can calculate hundreds of thousands of hashes per second. You could effectively tamper with a block and recalculate all the hashes of other blocks to make your blockchain valid again. So to mitigate this, blockchains have something that is called proof of work. It's a mechanism that slows down the creation of new blocks. In Bitcoin's case, it takes about 10 minutes to calculate the required proof of work and add a new block to the chain. This mechanism makes it very hard to tamper with the blocks because if you tamper with one block, you'll need to recalculate the proof of work for all the following blocks. So the security of a blockchain comes from its creative use of hashing and the proof of work mechanism. But there is one more way that blockchains secure themselves, and that is by being distributed. Instead of using a central entity to manage the chain, blockchains use a peer-to-peer network and everyone is allowed to join. When someone joins this network, he gets a full copy of the blockchain. The node can use this to verify that everything is still in order. Now, let's see what happens when someone creates a new block. That block is sent to everyone on the network. Each node then verifies the block to make sure that it hasn't been tampered with. And if everything checks out, each node adds this block to their own blockchain. All the nodes in this network create consensus. They agree about what blocks are valid and which aren't. Blocks that are tampered with will be rejected by other nodes in the network. So to successfully tamper with a blockchain, you'll need to tamper with all the blocks on the chain, redo the proof of work for each block, and take control of more than 50% of the peer-to-peer network. Only then will your tempered block become accepted by everyone else, so this is almost impossible to do. Blockchains are also constantly evolving. One of the most recent developments is the creation of smart contracts. These contracts are simple programs that are stored on the blockchain and can be used to automatically exchange coins based on certain conditions. More on smart contracts in a later video. The creation of blockchain technology piqued a lot of people's interest. Soon others realized that this technology could be used for other things, like storing medical records, creating a digital notary, or even collecting taxes. So now you know what a blockchain is, how it works on a basic level, and what problems it solves. Want to learn how you can implement a simple blockchain in JavaScript? Then check out this video here. And as always, thank you very much for watching.
All right, guys, so hopefully you got the gist of that. It's pretty complicated, but incredibly sophisticated. And of course, and I'm sure all you know this, it's the fundamental foundation of cryptocurrency. Bitcoin is the first and the most ubiquitous form of cryptocurrency, which is something that has an incredibly wide-ranging utility worldwide, but in the law enforcement context is often quite difficult to be dealing with because it is used by cyber criminals to move money around, and because it doesn't go through any Federal Reserve System, pretty hard for police to track. Okay, the future of crime and surveillance. So we've talked a lot about surveillance basically and how ubiquitous it is. Video equipment is found on property, personal devices, cameras, right? We also know that, that it provides a valuable source of information, provides information on contacts on devices. Text information obviously is a valuable tool for background in investigations. GPS obviously is incredibly important. You can track somebody in a vehicle or personally and basically determine if and when they were at the scene of a crime at the particular time the crime took place. That's obviously incredibly important. It's also, surveillance, is also incredibly useful to benefit people, and this is incredibly a good story. This is a story that came out in the news yesterday, right? And for those of you who watched the Raptors win the NBA championship last year, at the very end, after the Raptors had won, Masai Ujiri, who is the owner of the Raptors, basically was coming through the crowd to get down to be with the teammates, and an altercation took place, and an altercation that led to a police officer suing him for damages. And what is really great about this particular video is that this video, which now became public yesterday, vindicates Ujiri and his interaction with the cop.
There is new video evidence that we are seeing this morning coming into play in a lawsuit a security guard launched last year against Raptors president.
Hang on a second.
There is new video evidence that we are seeing this morning coming into play in a lawsuit a security guard launched last year against Raptors president Masai Ujiri. You remember that shoving match at last year's NBA match. Well, Michael Serapio is looking at all of this for us, the new video and its new meaning, maybe, and impact in this case.
Yeah, absolutely, because we're talking about a case in the tens of thousands of dollars US here. As you say, Heather, the security guard, really a deputy sheriff that was hired to do security at the Oracle Center in Oakland, California. Game 6, as you know, of course, the Raptors beating Golden State, huge moment for the franchise. So you saw Masai Ujiri want to make his way to the court, but was stopped. And take a look at what this new video shows up, because if you take a look to the left of the screen, that is the sheriff that was circled in red there. Coming on the right side, again now circled, is Ujiri himself making his way. And as the two approach each other, it is not Ujiri who shoves the deputy first, but you see right there, the deputy shoves Ujiri not once, but twice before Ujiri responds with a shove back of his own. In fact, if you take a close look of what happened, Ujiri was trying to get his credentials from his suit jacket to prove he had a right to be on the court to celebrate with his team. But even before he could do that, well, the deputy sheriff was already grabbing his jacket lapel, pushing him back. Take a close-up look and take a listen as well. Now, I don't know if it was very clear, but Ujiri was stating he was the president of the Toronto Raptors there. He looked incredulous that this was happening. Again, pushed not just once, but twice. And this does seemingly back up the claim that Masai Ujiri is making in a document to the California courts, because in it he says it was the sheriff's deputy, Alan Strickland, who started the incident, after which bystanders intervened, got Ujiri on the court with his team. Now, we should note, again, Strickland and his wife are suing the Raptors president for $75,000 US. They're suing for general and punitive damages. But now this video, first shared by the local Fox station in the Bay Area, so certainly people in the Oakland and San Francisco area know now this vantage point because of this body camera, and now this video also confirmed by CBC News. Heather.
What about the Raptors now, Michael? Are they reacting to the new video at all?
Well, they are standing firm. Take a look at the statement from the franchise themselves. This is what they have to say. We have always maintained that the claims made against Masai are baseless and entirely without merit. We believe this video evidence shows exactly that Masai was not an aggressor, but instead was the recipient of two very violent, unwarranted actions. So all this going on as the proceedings continue in this civil suit between the deputy sheriff and the president of the Raptors, but of course going to play a big part in the case now, and we'll keep following it, Heather.
Okay, Michael, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, so that's really good news. It was nice to see that, the way it's unfolding, so that's great. But it was a body cam, right, that took those pictures. And the issue of body cams for police using them in their day-to-day activities is a controversial one. We're going to watch this short video on Canadian police forces and why they use or don't want to use them. And there's some news about the Toronto Police Service today about this particular utility. And I'll tell you why and why not both police and those accused of crimes do and do not want body cams. There you go.
There are growing calls in Canada for police officers to wear body cams on the job in places like Toronto and Montreal. There have been pilot projects and tests. Activists in the wake of the George Floyd story urging police chiefs to deploy them immediately. And John Northcott is here to look more at that story. John, one that really seems to be taking off in Montreal, notably.
In Montreal, but it's being discussed right across the country. Heather, this is a situation where three letters you're going to hear a lot of in the coming weeks. BWC. Body-worn cameras. There have been pilot projects in a number of cities across this country. The Vancouver project underway, in fact, was put to one side because of the COVID-19 crisis. Calgary officers do use them. Ottawa's chief, Peter Slowly, says he is going to look into it. Montreal's mayor, Valerie Plante, says after initially in the past saying it might be too expensive, is going to push ahead with it. And we've seen this push across the country for a couple of reasons, not the least of which the death of George Floyd in the United States, but also in this country, the death of a young woman during an interaction with police. It was a call made by her family. There she is there, Regis Korchinski-Paquette. Officers showed up to intervene. Something happened. She fell to her death from 24 floors up. They weren't wearing body cams because none of the police officers do in Toronto. Had they been wearing them, the investigation might have been a lot easier and a lot clearer. Toronto's chief, Mark Saunders. Have a listen.
This is a textbook case as to why I've been advocating for body-worn cameras, and I'm now fast-tracking to the best of my ability to allow that process to speed up so we can have access to body-worn cameras as soon as possible.
There is, in fact, a petition underway that is getting pretty close to the 75,000 signatures that they want to have Toronto police introduce those body cams. Interestingly, a number of police associations and unions across the country say that they are in favor of officers wearing body cams. Heather?
So there is a lot of activism pressure to have, as you've suggested, John, cities look at this and forces look at this. But what are some of the challenges? Why is it not in more widespread use already, for example?
Well, a couple of reasons. New technology. So there's literally the technology to work out about it. There is cost, tens of millions of dollars in some jurisdictions. This is a situation where, again, amidst COVID-19, we're seeing city budgets being torn apart with politicians wondering how they're going to afford basic city services moving forward. So that's an issue as well. Let's listen again to Mark Saunders from the Toronto Force.
We get this out, it is going to be the right kit with the right training, with the right procedures and policies in place. And understanding that, the body-worn cameras is not the end all, but what it is an added tool that can give an objective account of what occurred during those moments. And so it will heighten, I believe, better opportunities for officers to tell their stories.
So again, the chief saying it allows the officers to tell their stories, but as we know in television, a single shot doesn't tell the whole story. The camera is only so wide, it's not 360 degrees. Audio can be an issue. Privacy as well. We saw in the death of Regis Korchinski-Paquet in Toronto. That was deemed to be a mental health call. Privacy issues around that, interactions with the public, other people captured on camera. All of this, again, technologically uncertain at the moment, but also legally. How much of it will stand up in court? When do you turn the camera off? What happened before and after the camera was turned off and on? So as this evolves, if cities can find the money, and again, the pressure is on, eventually this will end up in many cases being ruled on by the courts in terms of what's admissible and what actually happened, despite the fact they have video to turn to. Heather?
John, thank you very much.
Yeah, so here's the thing. So this morning, the news, John Tory, who's the mayor of Toronto, announced that in fact, and he's also sitting on the Toronto Police Services Board, that in fact Toronto Police Service will have body cams. And it's obviously the largest police service in Canada, so it's a big deal. But again, these things aren't without some controversy. They have pros and cons. Some police associations, although the tide seems to be, going towards it, it's a good thing. Some have argued that their police officers should not have to wear body cams because they are entitled, believe it or not, to their privacy if within their work environment. So they do not believe that everything that they do should be recorded. All right, and then that brings up the issue of, all right, so if that's the case, should the officers have the ability to turn them on and off, right? To basically determine at what points will, in fact, what they are doing, in the line of duty be recorded. That's a really, really tough question, because when it comes to admission of evidence, obviously the cross-examination is going to say, why was it turned on or turned off at this particular point? What happened outside the frame of the video being taken? Body cameras are also a really interesting issue with respect to the issue of wrongful convictions and false confessions. So wrongful convictions it happens to be my area of expertise. It's my doc for research, but is the #1 area for law reform in criminal justice around the world. The fact that exponentially, people are being wrongfully convicted for any number of reasons. The #1 reason I can tell you is mistaken eyewitness identification, that in fact, 80% of all wrongful convictions contain a mistaken ID, which means, quite simply, that witnesses to the crime identify the wrong person. And it happens all the time. It's incredible. Believe it or not, the second highest cause of wrongful convictions is what's called false confessions. And that's kind of counterintuitive. I mean, why would somebody in their right mind actually confess to a crime? Well, as it turns out, 25% of all cases of wrongful conviction have a false confession. And the reasons pretty much revolve around police coercion. Right, police, basically, torture is a very harsh expression, but they do coerce, pressure, and put people in stressful situations to a great degree, where over the course of time they confess just to stop what is in fact a very difficult interrogation going forward. And the thing about body cams in those cases, this is of course when these interviews don't take place in a police station, which is going to have an interview room with hopefully a camera running all the time in it. although police aren't required by law to do that, believe it or not. The Supreme Court of Canada has made it very clear that even when confessions are obtained in rooms where cameras were available but they weren't turned on, they're still admissible, right? Which is a very, very difficult position to live with, right? Well, confessions are also obtained out in the field, right? At scenes of crimes at the time when people are arrested. It would be really, really useful for accused people who basically take the position that they were coerced into giving a confession to have a video record of whatever interrogation, interviewing techniques took place, giving rise to that confession, right? Because again, as counterintuitive it may sound, a lot of people do in fact confess when they're in fact innocent, just to stop the interrogation. And the problem with that is that it's almost always happens in those cases when people confess when they knew they were innocent, but they just wanted to stop the madness. Basically, they pretty much turn around quickly and recant that confession, saying, "Look, I was forced into it. It's not a true confession. I didn't commit the crime." The problem is that false confession is almost always admissible at trial. It goes to the jury. The jury will hear the confession that's taken place, and no matter how much the person who recanted it screams up and down that, I was forced to say that, I didn't mean it, I'm actually innocent, I didn't mean to confess, I was, the confession was unwarranted and coerced. Once the jury hears the confession, any explanation about how it was arrived at and it's not relied upon any longer by the accused goes out the window, right? And that's what, of course, leads to wrongful convictions. Anyway, having said that, so that's why body cams are an interesting and still a controversial tool. But again, the movement is clearly to have most police services have them in place, but the rules around their utility, when they're turned off and when they're turned on, is incredibly important, because those are the rules that are going to determine, how admissible is any, camera footage obtained with the body camera, how admissible is it going to be in a court of law, all right? Or having said that, of course, it's great to have body cams for cases like Ujiri and the Raptors. Okay, the future of crime and surveillance. So this comes from your text. There are concerns that videos can be faked, right? And that's absolutely true. There's all kinds of ways that videos can be faked so that people's faces can be put on other people's bodies in a pretty seamless kind of way, right? So, this gives rise to the need for what's called digital forensic capabilities, so that when videos are being offered as evidence in court, they have to be verifiable, right? Just like any other kinds of evidence we talked about at the beginning of the class, evidence has to be, verifiable and reliable. And that includes video evidence, right? We now have dashboard cams, again, BWCs, the body-worn cameras. These things are incredibly important. Again, it was mentioned in the CBC piece we just watched, the cameras video of basically the torture of George Floyd. In the U.S., the pressure on his neck, basically I can't breathe, being caught on camera, eventually did, of course, lead to not only charges against the officer who put his knee on his neck, but the other officers who were basically involved in that circumstance. So that obviously is a very, very useful use of cameras to capture crimes taking place and being used as evidence, right? But of course, all of this again results in the need for regulations, on how they can be used and when when they cannot be used for the purposes of investigations, right? Balancing privacy with public safety. All right, so officers are concerned, and this is a theme that we've had throughout the course, not to violate people's privacy when collecting personal information. Personal information, of course, being collected by way of cameras. In the future, public may not tolerate non-consensual use of personal data. Right, this isn't just video data any longer, but any data. So, again, we've talked about this, and when can these rights to privacy give rise to basically the data not being used? The police are actively, a lot of police sources are actively seeking to have back doors into sources of data, including social media, Facebook, Instagram, what have you, where that they basically can access the data through a backdoor to get around any encryptions that are put in place to actually protect people from data breaches, right? And obviously those things tend to be opposed by those who manufacture these devices or operate social media and privacy groups. So that's obviously important. The future of policing, so, basically biometrics and the use of biometrics is becoming an interesting kind of thing and includes microchipping. So this means, and the text talks about it, putting microchips into yourself, under your skin, in your thumb kind of thing. They're the size of a grain of rice, which I would think I'd know it was there. And they're used for all kinds of things, to open doors, operate machinery, turn on passwords for your devices, all those kind of things. So that's kind of interesting. But of course, doing microchipping is a very interesting kind of prospect for the future of crime prevention, depending on how widespread microchipping becomes, right? Because it's clearly a GPS device if it's embedded in somebody's body, right? So that's obviously an important tool. All right, and here's a video basically on Sweden, which is actually pretty pro microchipping of people. So let's just watch this. It's not that long.
When Elias Brotberger goes to work, he doesn't need ID, and he doesn't need money. In fact, much of what he needs to get through the day is hidden right there, just below the surface, in his hand.
You like to touch it?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Oh, weird. Yeah, it's like a grain of rice.
Yeah, a grain of rice.
Embedded in his hand is a microchip that serves as his keys, his ID, and his wallet.
Yeah, it's all in chip, so I use it to get around the building.
Buy snacks.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's buy some snacks. Exactly. So I can't open it.
No.
Okay.
So what I need to do is I need to first blip my chip, and it will log me in, and from there I get access to the fridge.
Popular TV shows like Black Mirror have imagined chips as part of a dystopian future.
Install ingrain procedure with local anesthetic and you're good to go.
In Sweden, the microchips are already here.
The microchip implants use the same technology that's in contactless credit cards,
which have made cash pretty much obsolete in Sweden.
No cash.
At this tech fair, a chipping event for those on the cutting edge, merging their hands with this new technology.
I thought it would be fun, right?
The process is simple and swift. A pinch of the skin, and in a matter of seconds, the chip is inserted. The transformation is complete. As for the pain,
I barely felt it.
But even in this nation of early adopters, not everyone is racing to get chipped.
Feel less human. I will feel like a robot.
I think, it's so much more data can go into this, when it's in your body.
There's no central registry tracking how many people are chipped, but biohacker Hannes Wellblood estimates between 5 and 10,000.
In the future, do you think everyone is going to be chipped?
I think it'll be voluntary, but I am certainly convinced that millions of people will find it very, very valuable to have a smart device under their skin.
Human microchipping may be our future, but in Sweden, it's already reality. Sarah Harmon, NBC News, Stockholm.
Okay, so that's really interesting and frightening to some degree. At least it is to me. That's the last thing in the world that I would ever have done to me is gives anybody that, or give that kind of invasive kind of thing implanted under my skin for whatever purpose. And trust me, even though it may be a benign purpose, like acting as a key or acting as a pin to access whatever it's going to be, this kind of thing also can collect easily data and your movements and all kinds of things. Is just out of curiosity, is there anybody who in the class, because you guys are much younger than I am, who would actually consider this kind of thing, or see a value in having this kind of thing happen? Okay, so I don't see any hands up. So I guess we're all on the same page when it comes to that. So that's good for the time being. Oh, Kate's raised her hand. Okay, Kate.
Hi, I'm not agreeing with it. I wouldn't do it, but
to me, like having a chip in your hand would make it so much easier for someone like a criminal to like just kind of chop off your hand and take all your banking information, your personal information. Or I know I'm going extreme, but that's personally why I wouldn't.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Although I can tell you, when my kids were small, I might have considered microchipping them to keep an eye on where they were, but that just isn't something that I'm on for. All right, thanks, Kate. Oh, two more. Right? Hang on a sec. What else we have? Anybody else's hand up? No. Oh, Carrie.
Yeah, hi. I would consider such things for violent offenders as a condition of their paroles. Those who would be on the sex offenders list or have been, been convicted of multiple murders. For that being a means for us to, as society, to always know, okay, yes, they are free in society, but we have the ability to know where they physically are at any time. If and if they break the parole, it's easy. Okay, I mean, it's the same thing as having a leg brace on, would it not be, for house arrest?
That's a great analogy, and I was thinking about that exactly while you were talking about it. And you're absolutely right. So we do, in a technologically assisted way, monitor the movement of people in the criminal justice system with leg bracelets. Everybody's seen them, or not necessarily seen them in person, but seen them on TV in the movies. They're used as a risk adverse mechanism to essentially keep, exactly as you're saying, Carrie, keep tabs on people in the situation of two situations, basically, if they're on bail or paroled early, right? So these are people who are still very much enmeshed in the criminal justice process, and people. People will be given, usually they're given the opportunity, look, you're asking for bail. This is the justice of the peace. We're going to grant you bail if you agree to a monitoring device, right? And the same thing, parole. We'll give you early parole if you agree to a monitoring device. And they, obviously, in the case of bail, they're only going to be in place until the bail comes to an end, which means they go to trial, and then it's no longer needed. And in parole, they're going to be in place to give somebody freedom. Instead of them still staying in prison, they get to be out, but they have to be monitored. But when the period of parole ends, then the bracelets come off. In both of those cases, the monitor, the ankle bracelets are interesting. I don't think I've talked to this class about it. I'm not sure. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's a pretty straightforward process. In Canada, if you're going to have an ankle bracelet, you have to pay for it yourself. The state doesn't pay for it. You have to have a landline, because that's the technology. It's based on a landline, and a lot of people don't have those anymore, so they have to get a landline. Obviously, pay for the cost of that. And if you live in an apartment, for instance, and your bail hearing is done, you go home. What's going to happen is within 24 hours, the person from the company you're paying for the bracelet will show up at your door. They'll come in. They'll ensure you have a landline. They'll take out the bracelet. They'll put it around your ankle, and it's secure. You can't take it off other than cut it off. And if you cut it off, that breaks the signal, and the monitoring company then notifies the police that there's a problem. And what they do is, if you're in an apartment, they just simply go around the interior walls of the apartment, and if you get a nice guy, they might go out on the balcony and do the interior walls of the balcony. And if they're not so nice, they just do the back of the balcony door, which means you can't get out of the balcony during the time that the ankle bracelet is keeping you in a location. And the way it almost always works is it's like house arrest. And yeah, they're also used for that purpose as a conditional sentence house arrest as well, for the period of the sentence. And so what essentially happens is that you're going to be allowed to go to work, right? Which is obviously a good thing, keeps people active and not looking for criminal activity to earn a living. You get to go to work. From 6 o'clock in the morning to 6 o'clock at night, basically, you're free to leave your residence. Same thing that happens to a house, right? They put it around the perimeter of the house, not your yard, the house. And so from 6 in the morning to 6 at night, you have it on, And then on the weekends, you'll usually get 3 or 4 hours on a Saturday or Sunday to go to the shopping, go grocery shopping and what have you. And then you can sometimes apply for special times to go for doctor's appointments and what have you, or court appointments. And that's it, right? And so Carrie's absolutely right. It's a monitoring way to do it. But in all cases, it ends at the end of the bail process, the parole process, or the sentencing process. So if we're talking about using these kind of things for sex offenders, for instance, that we always want to know where they are, particularly, and again, the level of sex offender registries that exist in Canada, and each province has one, as well as the federal government has one. The level of registration, which means public disclosure of where sex offenders live, depends upon the severity of the crime. It's a sliding scale. So maybe an argument could be made that if you are convicted of this kind of offense, then you've given up your right to privacy, again, privacy, in your life going forward. Basically, that in fact, if you want to be out in the community after having committed sex offenses, particularly against children, then we want to know exactly where you are all the time, right? So I guarantee you the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, to which I belong, would probably have a problem with that, even for sex offenders, right? That people, still should be entitled to some level of a life going forward after offenses they've committed. Although again, there are registries that are in place that sometimes will provide information to communities when offenders move into their communities. Anybody have anything else to add to that kind of conversation? A really good one, particularly about the prospect of maybe chipping people going forward. Any other thoughts about that? Thanks, Carrie. Really good point. I was thinking about that while you're saying it, so good for you. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about in cybercrime, and of course, technology, new technology, it's not so new anymore, but obviously is the use of DNA, right? And DNA quite clearly is the most accurate tool to identify somebody, either as somebody who committed a crime or to basically eliminate somebody from being a prospective suspect, right? They can take somebody out of that pool or put them into the pool. But the problem, of course, is that the use of DNA, although again in TV, movies, and what have you, you see it all the time in crime dramas. It's very, very limited in its use. In fact, it only exists in 10 to 15 of all cases, of all crimes, where in fact there has been usually some biologic evidence taken. So, in close contact homicides or assaults, and particularly sexual assaults, which all involve close contact, then it's really only in those kind of situations where DNA is available as a crime tool, to some degree. So let's watch this video. This video deals with, and this is really, really cool, about the collection of DNA that is given voluntarily to Ancestry.com or 23andMe.com, people who want to basically trace their roots and their family trees through DNA.
So far this year, law enforcement has identified over 70 suspects using a new technique called genetic genealogy. This is the same tool that detectives in California used last year to identify the so-called Golden State Killer. In the first of 2 stories, William Brangham explains how this tool works and why it has raised serious privacy concerns. It begins with the murder of a young couple in Washington state, a case that became the first ever genetic genealogy case to go to trial. This is part of our Leading Edge series on science and technology.
In 1987, under the High Bridge in rural Washington state, a young man named Jay Cook was found murdered. His girlfriend, Tanya Van Kylenberg, was found in the woods 60 miles away. She'd been raped and murdered. The only piece of evidence was semen from an unknown man found on Tanya's clothes. But it didn't match anyone, even after police DNA databases developed in the following years. Eventually, the case went cold. But 18 years later, Snohomish County Detective James Scharf picked up the case. He turned to the public for new leads.
There's a brain backpack that the person might have had, a black jacket, and a Minolta camera.
But still, nothing.
These were totally innocent kids, 20 and 18 years old. So this was a case that I really wanted to solve.
But the person who would eventually help crack the case was not in law enforcement at all. CeCe Moore is what's known as a genetic genealogist, someone who helps people trace their family ancestry.
By about 2012, I think it was starting to kind of bubble to the surface with a few of us that what we're doing could have law enforcement applications. But it wasn't time yet. The databases were too small.
But that was all about to change when commercial DNA testing suddenly went mainstream.
Don't just give a gift. Give them Ancestry DNA.
DNA testing services like Ancestry.com and 23andMe have exploded in popularity. It's estimated that more than 26 million people have now used companies like this.
The process of testing your DNA is actually pretty simple. You order the kit online. These each cost about $100 each. And then you just spit some saliva into a tube like this, you mail it in, and in a few weeks, you get your DNA reports.
As millions of people started getting their DNA results, many of them copied their data into other public websites so they could better find distant family members. But CeCe Moore realized this wealth of information could also be used to help solve cold cases.
We have 2 matches at the top of the list that are both sharing about 3% of their DNA with the unknown suspect.
She demonstrated how she did it in the Cook Van Cuylenburg case. She took the unknown suspect's DNA from that semen sample and compared it to DNA results in the databases. She found 2 partial matches, people who were likely the killer's 2 second cousins.
So if you share 3% of your DNA with someone, then you're most likely second cousins, which means you share great-grandparents. So I'm going to build these trees back to great-grandparents.
From there, she went back in time, up the family tree, up to the great-grandparents of those cousins.
We should find the common ancestor at this level somewhere with the unknown suspect.
From there, moving down the family tree, she searched public documents and obituaries to find where these 2 families converged. This family would likely be the suspect's immediate family, his parents and siblings.
But from the DNA, we know it's a male, and these are daughters.
This was how she identified the likely culprit.
This allows me to zero in on just this one male as the potential suspect. It was a very odd moment to be looking at the name of the person I believed to be a killer and know that I was the only person in the world who probably knew what he had done other than himself. But this was a very heavy discovery, and I just wanted to quickly get that name to Detective Scharf and get that off my shoulders.
For Detective Scharf, this was a huge lead, but not enough to make an arrest. He'd need actual DNA from the suspect to know for sure. And so, a coffee cup discarded by the suspect was collected by the police and tested. When the results came back, it was a match.
And I got tears in my eyes, and then I screamed that, yeah, we finally got this case solved. It was just such a wonderful feeling.
Yesterday, we took into custody a 55-year-old SeaTac man who is suspected of the 1987 murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenburg.
This summer, 56-year-old William Earl Talbot II went on trial for the murder of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenburg. Talbot pled not guilty and never took the stand. His lawyers argued that the presence of Talbot's semen at the crime scene could have been from consensual sex.
There was evidence consistent with sexual intercourse, but not injuries associated with assault. She wasn't bruised and battered. There wasn't evidence of sexual assault.
The only definitive thing linking Talbot to the crime was this DNA match. After 2 days of deliberation, the jury convicted Talbot of first-degree murder for both Cook and Von Cuylenburg. He was sentenced to life in prison. This was the first ever trial and conviction on a case cracked open by genetic genealogy.
Without genetic genealogy, this case never would have been solved. CeCe Moore did in 2 hours what 20 or 30 cops couldn't do in 30 years of working on this case. That's how powerful genetic genealogy is in solving crimes.
In our next story, we'll explore the deeper privacy implications of this technique and why some are so concerned about this new crime-fighting tool.
And what that story obviously relates to is the fact that when you do give your DNA to these commercial bases, these information bases for your family tree, there is no disclaimer, that's attached to that saying, by the way, when you basically provide us with this information, we will share it with the police when they come looking for it, right? So that's, again, overall, the primary subject of the semester was the issue of privacy and access to information in contravention of that privacy. Okay, guys, listen, the last slide and the last PowerPoint deal with artificial intelligence. I leave that for you, and there's a short video there for you to watch, but it's like 9:30 now, so I want to make sure we get in the breakout questions. So again, I'm going to break you into 4 rooms for 15 minutes, and then we should be able to have everybody's responses and be done actually on or before 10 o'clock, the deadline. All right, guys, so I will break you out and I will see you shortly.